Are you thinking about what Bitcoin might mean in your retirement plan or investment portfolio? Or wondering if you should consider buying some Bitcoin instead of something else? Bitcoin is the most important financial tool people should be thinking about today, but how to get there is less obvious, and part of the issue is it's almost impossible to get good financial advice about Bitcoin. Our guest this week is Morgen Rochard, who is a certified financial planner trailblazing this important concept. You're listening to The Block Reward, the show where we help you understand Bitcoin without you having to be obsessed with it. I'm Scott Dedels. I'm the CEO and founder of Block Rewards, and part of our mission in bringing Bitcoin to the workplace is helping people understand how it will help them. So if you're ready to learn something about how Bitcoin might impact your own financial world and your long-term financial plans, stick around. This episode should help a lot. All right, welcome to another episode of the Block Reward podcast. Our guest this week is CFP, Morgen Rochard, and we are going to be talking about Bitcoin in financial planning. Welcome, Morgen. Thanks for coming to the show.
It's nice to be here. Thanks for having me on, Scott.
For our listeners who are more in the sort of new to Bitcoin space, maybe if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey with your practice in helping people invest in Bitcoin.
Yeah, definitely. So I've been working in finance now for over 15 years. I started my registered investment advisory firm about almost 10 years ago now, which is kind of crazy. I was working I worked for Merrill Lynch, and then I worked at UBS, and I just thought, well, I like what I'm doing. I just really don't like where I'm doing it. And I'd heard about going independent, but I didn't realize that going independent meant that you can literally just be one person who opened a shop and do financial planning for people, until I came across somebody who was literally doing that. And I thought, well, if this guy could do that, for sure I can do it, which, maybe is saying something about like the level of risk I'm willing to take as a person, that you just see somebody else doing it and you think, whatever, I can go for it. But that's what I did. I sort of flew by the seat of my pants and opened up a firm. And here we are 10 years later. So it's worked out, thank God. And yeah, it started as just like more of a cut and dry investment management firm. I had my CFA and I thought I knew everything and that I could do everything. And I guess honestly, the more I've been in practice, the less I actually think I know. And the more I think that the world can teach me a thing or two. About 3 years into my practice, I realized that I needed to do financial planning for people, not just investment management. People don't want just a wannabe hedge fund manager. They want somebody who can give them real advice about the problems that they are going through as an individual. And so my practice pivoted in 2016 to becoming a financial planning firm. And coincidentally, is actually the first time I advised on Bitcoin. I had some client come through who was interested, who had heard about it. And I started giving some advice about Bitcoin in 2016 and then again in 2017. And from there, it's just sort of been an upward path, I would say, for me getting where I am now. I now have people who have been involved in Bitcoin coming through in my practice who have financial planning questions. They are already orange pilled. They're already bought into the fact that, Bitcoin is the way for them. They just have other questions related to their life and how this fits in and how they can really make all of the pieces of their finances work. And so I would say 10 years later now, in the last 3 years, we're finally getting like the clientele that I kind of always hoped that we would have here. But yeah, it's been a long journey for sure. And it's certainly, I feel like we're just going up and up from here.
Totally. And I think you make a great point there. There's a gap yet to be filled in terms of people understanding that Bitcoin has an important place in financial plans. But I also think that on the other end, it's not the only part of the plan. And you're a good source of sort of content around that idea. And I think a lot of the hardcore Bitcoin people really do just think you can stop there. And
for sure. I think in general, though, it's hard for people because there's this concept that two things can be true, and two things are true is very hard to wrap our mind around, because on the one hand, it means that like it doesn't necessarily mean that your idea is wrong, right? It means that your idea is right, but there's also something else that's right too. And they could be married hand in hand. And two things are true don't mean that whatever you're thinking is wrong. But our brains aren't really that wired for that, to like hold two thoughts in the same place. And so I think that I find that people can be very all or nothing. And it's not just in the Bitcoin world. It's like that in general, where people are, you're set on a specific path and you start going down that path, and that path is true. And that's right. It is true, right? But there's something else that's also true, and they can fit into your financial plan together.
You were, I would say, among earlier to Bitcoin. And when you were first giving advice about Bitcoin to clients, was that before or after that you understood Bitcoin?
That's a great question. Probably before, to be honest. I feel like the more I definitely what I know now is not what I knew then. And certainly the way I could describe Bitcoin itself, what money is, what the network is doing, everything else is probably going to pale in comparison to what I'll be able to tell people in 10 years from now, I would imagine. So whatever I know now is probably not even a tenth of what I hope to know in the future. But what I knew then is definitely much less than what I know now. And so I think it's a testament to, as long as you know enough, you could probably give reasonable advice. And I think that that's sort of knowing that we don't all know everything all the time. I think that that's why we should be conservative in how we give advice. Right. And so instead of being like, okay, go all in, everything's great, you're going to be fine. Right. Like my stance on it is, okay, like I might be wrong about things. So maybe like we look at the situation the way that we see it now, and we can make a determination with the knowledge that we have, make the best recommendation that we could possibly make at this time. And if we have to change it later, then we do.
Yeah, and I think you raised another good point there about how the information that was available in 2016 or 2015 and the consensus sort of opinion of what it was would have been a lot different. Like the market is understanding Bitcoin better all the time. So this is kind of those people who wish they would have bought Bitcoin at X price. But like the reason you didn't is because there was just so much. It was so much more of an unknown, exponentially more unknown earlier on, right? The farther back you go, the less price information we understood, but also just what it was going to do. I think a lot of these opinions that we have of what's happening today definitely have the benefit of hindsight of now having seen several cycles and this trend is at least appears to be building a pattern.
Yeah, it's a lot easier for sure to make predictions about what you would do in the past when you know what has happened now. And I think that we often think that if we had bought, in 2012 or whatever, we would be holding it today. I actually did a lot of research for a book that I'm currently writing. It's the Bitcoin Personal Finance book. And I talked to a lot of people about their experiences. And what I found was that the people who came in the earliest had actually sold the most Bitcoin. And that's for a number of reasons, right? The first thing being that they weren't sure whether or not it was going to work out, right? And they had made quite a lot of money. And so there's no way that somebody could have known in 2011 that it was going to be $60,000, $70,000 in 2021, right? It's very, very hard to see price action that far in the future, in which case if you 10x, 20x, 30x from where you bought it and you sell some, right, it's not saying like there's nothing wrong with that person, right? I think in the community, we often think like, oh, you have to hold forever, right? But just given people's financial situations, right, maybe that may or may not make sense. And so there's that portion of it. There's the other portion of, where people lose their Bitcoin or they stored it improperly or they left it on an exchange and that exchange got hacked. There was a lot of that stuff that also happened, in which case, it's hard to know whether or not if you were that person who bought it in 2011 or 2012 that you wouldn't have been caught up in something like Mt. Gox, or you wouldn't have been caught up in everything that went on with Charlie Shrem back in the day, or, you wouldn't have bought a different coin for whatever reason. So, and then there was also like the block size war that happened, right? Like people were very nervous in 2017. So it's just hard for people to have, like, it's easy for people to see what happened after it did, but it's hard to know whether or not you would have been able to hold through it all.
Absolutely. And it's even now, it's an extremely emotional asset to hold. And that phenomenon would have been much worse the earlier on you were in Bitcoin, for sure. I also think an interesting dynamic back to this idea of hindsight is the people understood inflation in some regard, say 10, 15 years ago. But I don't think it had anywhere near the urgency or the relevance that it does today. Like this is also something that is an emerging condition of our evolving financial sort of global financial system that I don't think was a narrative that would have resonated with people nearly like it does now 10 or 12 years ago.
Yeah, definitely. So I first started my career in 2008, basically right while the global financial crisis was happening. I started working in June, and Bear Stearns had already gone under that March. And so it was like we didn't know obviously in June that like what was going to happen happened. But if we recall, right, the government started printing massive quantities of money come September, October, November of that year. And I remember I was working as a trader at the time. And so there was a guy on the team who there was this ETF called TLT. I think it still exists. It's like the 10-year, I think it's the 10-year treasury bond. Sorry. And for all the listeners who are TLT experts, like, please don't hold me accountable if it's the 30-year bond. I'm really not sure. It could be 10 or 30. And so he had it in his mind that like he had to be short TLT and long TIPS. TIPS is the inflation related bond because he thought, well, the government's printing all this money. So of course there's going to be inflation. Like it's a certainty in my mind. I'm going to be short TLT and I'm going to be long TIPS. And if anybody knows what happened at that time, that's exactly the opposite of what he should have been doing, because basically, we were in a deflationary spiral. It was the reason why the government got involved, and them printing massive amounts of money for whatever reason, injecting liquidity into a system that had no liquidity, right? It had no effect on the prices. And obviously, like we've seen the catastrophic effects of that 15 years later, because they didn't just stop printing money there. They kept printing money year after year. And we probably would have been fine if they just printed that year and we all moved on and we went back to what we were normally doing. But instead, no, like they kept injecting liquidity into the system continually. And then it was like, okay, well, this is now just what we do when there's a crisis. We inject liquidity into the system without really thinking about what the repercussions of that might be. And of course, there have been writers and other economists who have come out who have just said, we can print money forever. We don't need to ever worry about this, right? Trust me, just print. And so I think now that we're seeing the shocks of what has happened from printing money year after year for 15 years without end, and really with no regard to what that could mean in the future, that, yeah, it's a much more interesting just proposition for people, because there's a way out now. There wasn't a way out before, right? The way out before was just like, all right, well, I guess I'll just buy stocks, stocks help me fight inflation. But the amount of savings that you have to have and the amount of commitment to investment through very rocky times, right? Stocks are not, they're pretty volatile, and people forget that, or they don't like to say that because it's so commonplace now to invest in stocks, whereas investing in Bitcoin, it's the most volatile thing you could possibly do. So like, stocks look really like much better from a volatility standpoint to the average person than something like Bitcoin does if you don't understand what it is. And so I think that, like, if we think about it from a contextual point of view, right, that back then it wasn't as exciting, the inflation narrative. But now when you go to the grocery store and, your eggs cost twice as much as they did just a year ago, right? It's very palpable. It's very easy to see why you would want an out from the current financial system.
Yeah, and to the point about stocks, people like Michael Saylor have done some really interesting work, I would say shining a light on maybe a little bit of the mirage of the index returns. And there was a presentation he gave recently to some, I think, investors in Argentina, comparing the actual not CPI, but the expansion of the money supply against the growth of the S&P. And the charts essentially look identical. So really, if you're buying the index, your money is basically just growing at the rate of the supply of money is growing. It's a really, I don't think people think that way about stocks when
Yeah, for sure. And like you're taking a lot of risk, right? Because you're relying on these companies to continue to grow, produce, do all the things that they're doing. You're relying on economies to continue to grow at the paces that they're growing. You're relying on there's a lot of other hidden risks that we don't see when we just buy a S&P 500 index that, yeah, maybe like the systematic risks of specific companies are taken out of that, but the risk of the system overall is still in there. And so I think for a lot of people, like why we want to hold money, right, is very obvious. And it's been made impossible by governments. People really just want to go to work. They want to earn a paycheck. They want to spend some of it, and then they want to save some of it. And they don't want to worry about putting it into an index fund or making sure that they're, getting all this tax savings by allocating it here and buying this over there, and, trying to outpace in some way by finding some interesting, exciting investment that they don't have time to really research. And so you're just forcing people beyond their risk tolerance over and over and over again, just to make sure that people go buy things every single year. The whole concept just seems crazy. Like when you really think about it, why they're doing inflation, it's like, is there really growth if everybody is not better off? If, we all have 2% dilution in our money every single year. And 2% is like at best, right? It's like the best case scenario is that you only lose 2% a year. Worst case scenario is obviously, you're in Zimbabwe and the paper that the money is printed on is worth more than the money itself.
Yeah, 2% is like your money loses half its value every 35 years. That's just as long as you're probably planning to work. So that's a huge headwind when you're thinking about planning for the future. And if it is much worse, like at 8%, then your money's losing half its value like less than a decade. It's crazy.
It is crazy. We work with dimensional funds quite a bit. And they give us stack for people, for advisors like me to give out. And they have these slides basically. And the first slide literally is, why should you invest? And you go to the next slide and they show you inflation. It's like, there's no pretending why we're doing this, right? Like government is, basically screwing you out of your money, right? And then you need financial advisors to allocate you as quickly as possible. And financial advisors, the only way they can allocate you as quickly as possible without you actually losing all of your money is by putting you in either these index style funds or these actively traded funds that hold many, many companies, so that you're diversified around the globe so that you don't necessarily lose in any one single company. It's not a great system, honestly, for the average person. And so the only way to really get ahead is to save a significant portion. And for what that means for the average person is that they're really living a lifestyle that they never, like a much lower lifestyle than they're willing to live. And so they're racking up debt or they're not saving enough. Or they're in a situation where, for whatever reason, they worked for a small company and they got some stock and that stock happened to, go up much more than the index, right? And now all of a sudden they're an overnight millionaire and they've got, the problems that come along with that. But that's not every person around, obviously, in America, right? So for most people, what they have to do is they have to really live much lower than their means. And for most people, that's going to mean saving somewhere between 20 and 30% of their pre-tax income just to, retire in 20 to 25 years. For a lot of people, that's just not feasible, just given where prices are going. And if the government keeps printing money, obviously, then prices go up and then it makes it harder for those people to save that 20 to 30% of their pre-tax income.
Yeah, there's, at least where I'm in Canada, there's a lot of people who have great careers and can't actually save any money. And they're not living lavish lifestyles. They're just, the crisis of affordability of housing up here. People are spending 60% of their after-tax income on rent. And it's like, so there isn't much room for a plan at that point other than, feed yourself. It's really wild. And I think, people shouldn't have to have a side gig as a hedge fund manager just to hopefully, be able to stop working one day. It just, none of this makes any sense.
Yeah, for sure. I think also like priorities of people are getting skewed. So for instance, like my family, I think is a good example of this. I'm extremely close to my parents. I grew up in New York. My family came over in the early 1900s, settled in Brooklyn, and basically never left. There is no reason why, other than the fact that our money has been inflated away to the point where I couldn't afford anything other than like a cardboard box under the bridge, for me to have left New York. I want to be around my family. I wanted to be close by them and have the same experience that I had growing up for my kids. But we had to move because we couldn't afford anything in my parents' neighborhood. And so if we were going to move pretty far from them, right, and then we're driving 2+ hours to see them, we might as well go move somewhere where, we can have the life that we want to have. So we ended up moving to Texas. And I think that my situation is not, it's not uncommon. And I know that because I deal with people like me in my practice all the time that have moved away from family, and then they have travel budgets, and then they, they have all these other unintended consequences from being inflated out of your money.
Yeah. It's going to be a fascinating thing. This is a total tangential statement, but to watch what unfolds with big cities over the next 10 and 15 and 20 years. And we'll see. So I am really curious to talk to you about some of this, continue on in these specific concepts of Bitcoin and helping people plan for the future. I do want to pause for a second and ask you this question that I ask every guest every week and start there. So when you get asked the question, how do you answer what Bitcoin is? So
Bitcoin is a promise of a different life. And I know that that's kind of a touchy-feely answer, I guess, to it. But that's really what it is, right? You're in a system right now where you have little control, little to no control over what the government is going to do with the money, what the monetary policy is going to be. You can't make decisions based on something that you don't know. And so I think that often people think of Bitcoin and they're like, well, it's hyper volatile. How can people make decisions based on Bitcoin? Maybe the price is hyper volatile. And maybe that will change in the future, right? And that's yet to be seen. But the monetary policy is not, right? The monetary policy is known and unchangeable. And when that is true, when you know the future of your money just based on that, then you can make decisions that are appropriate for your financial situation. The example I like to use for this is an easy one. So I have a client who works in manufacturing, right? If you're working in manufacturing, you're very beholden to what interest rates are and how they affect your business. And especially because like manufacturing now has become a global thing, right? So it's not even that you're relying on just this government decisions. You're relying on many government's decisions, depending on where your business is located and so forth. How can somebody, just an average person who's, running a business, it's not even a big business, just, a decent sized business in America, how can they possibly make good decisions when they don't know what next year is going to bring? They don't know whether or not they're going to lower interest rates or raise them. They don't know whether or not they're going to inject more liquidity into the system or take it out. They get no insight from FOMC about what future decisions might be. They're not well versed enough to be looking at these things the way stock analysts and bond analysts are looking at these charts all the time and trying to make decisions about what FOMC will do based on what they think the futures curve looks like, right? Like, that's not what the average person wants to be doing. The average person wants to be running their manufacturing business, right? And that's what the average person should be doing. They should, and there actually shouldn't be this many analysts looking at interest rates all the time, right? So for me, Bitcoin is the promise of a future where people can actually just involve themselves in what they want to involve themselves in their life and not have to worry about the financial system. Like what's happening in the financial system itself in order to make good decisions.
I love that answer. Then there is no wrong answer, but you raise a number of interesting points, and I wrote down a tweet of yours and I'm going to read it just so I get it exactly right. But it's very similar to what you just said, and it was, Bitcoin scarcity is a promise, not a probability. And I think you raised such an interesting point because it is reframing it around this concept of when you're thinking about long-term future planning, what are the things where you could potentially have some certainty? And I don't think people do understand Bitcoin's permanent rule system as something that could provide that certainty.
Yeah, definitely. The network itself, right? They prioritize the Bitcoin network prioritizes basically the certainty as much as they can, and also just the security of the network. And so if you know that everybody, because it's money and they want certainty with their money and they want security with their money, right? And that every single time they're going to prioritize those two things over everything else. If you know that, then you can have some comfort in how you use that money. Whereas if you look at our current system, right, they don't prioritize really any of that. There's no priority on security, right? They have basically trusted third parties everywhere. Those trusted third parties may or may not be trustworthy, right? And then there's also just the certainty. There's literally no certainty. We have no certainty other than, a group of people going into a room and making a decision and then telling us what they decided. And so, yes, there's certainty after their decision, right? That's what they've decided and that things are going to proceed. And obviously, like, they're not, all knowing, and they're not God, and they don't actually get to, make up that much. They get to make up what's going on, like, in the very, very short term. And there's debate about whether or not they even have control over that. But that just goes to show that there's even less certainty, right? That these people can, say they have control over things and that they are going to make decisions that are going to provide this certainty, and yet they can't even do that, right? And so there's just a lot less of that in the current financial system. And I think that if people looked at, what they're trading, maybe there's some volatility in your money, fine, and you use it as long-term savings instead of short-term savings, just based on, practicality of how much, how many businesses or places accept Bitcoin at this point. But that's not the future where I see it going, right? In the future, I see that people are going to accept these things side by side, and then eventually there will just be one currency.
Mm-hmm. I definitely want to come back to that point. One thing I think also worth adding to your point about monetary policy is there's also a total lack of accountability, because in democratic countries where the systems are sort of stable, we get to have semi-regular elections, but whichever team, it doesn't really impact their willingness to spend money, and so that they don't. The governments by their nature don't have a mechanism to make sure that they're making good decisions with the money that they're spending. Other than they may lose the next election as a result, but even that, debatably, political cycles are long enough that you can have a few big foibles and still come out okay on the next time people get a chance to vote. So maybe to ask you just like a slightly different question, when you have people, either your existing clients that want to learn more about Bitcoin or new people who have found you and to consider starting to work with you, how would you describe Bitcoin to them in terms of what it does and what it may do for their ability to plan for the future?
Yeah, definitely. So for clients who started with me and didn't come in as people who have been involved in Bitcoin, just the regular person who needs financial planning. So for them, we do have a what is money conversation, because I would say the average person does not actually know what money is. Money to most people is just something you go buy your coffee with, or something that you tip your delivery guy with. It's not. And for most people also, yeah, they use money for day-to-day things, but they don't even really touch money anymore, right? Like most people don't use cash anymore. Most people are using Venmo as their cash now. And when they go to the grocery store, they use a credit card. Like they're not even really touching money anymore. It's just a value that they see on their screen, and they want, the value to go up, right? I mean, most people, right, they want the value to go up, and they definitely don't want it to go negative. And that's the extent of what people think about their money. And then when they think about savings, we've been so ingrained into thinking of savings as investment, right? Because we can't actually have savings, that then we need to have a conversation about, okay, you can have savings that's not investment, and this is how you can do it. And so for most people, they see Bitcoin as just another investment, but Bitcoin is a savings technology, right? And so it's the ability for people to put their money into something where it doesn't have the risk of a company, it doesn't have the risk of a government, right? But it's also not going to lose value. It's like this mind-blowing proposition for most people of how could that possibly be the case? And so just going through that, for most people is going to be a good enough intro to take some sort of position in it. And then from there, we discuss about what's appropriate from a long-term savings point of view. I would say the hardest thing, though, I've had to deal with is that clients can't flip that switch from investment to savings. And it takes a long time for people to do that. And it takes many hours of education. So for the average advisor, who has 150, 200 clients, something like that, and you meet with them once or twice a year, you're not going to be able to lay the groundwork and give the kind of education that you need to give to the average person to make them feel comfortable holding this as a savings technology. In which case, if it's just going to be another sleeve in their portfolio where you're allocating, 1 to 3% to something like Bitcoin, then you're going to be rebalancing. You're going to be doing it in a way that's not actually appropriate for the client, and potentially not harmful. I would say it's better to hold any amount of Bitcoin, I would say. But, it's the reason why ETF is exciting, right? It's because there's this whole group of people that they want access to Bitcoin, but they don't really even know what it is. They just think it's something you buy in your brokerage account, right? And so obviously there are many layers of education that need to go into what a client actually needs to be doing, which is buying Bitcoin outright and holding it and so forth, and how they store it. And then there's estate planning considerations once you're doing all of these things. So the list goes on and on and on of how many things this affects from a financial planning standpoint. I think I actually don't even remember your question because I started going on a tangent there. Sorry about that. But that's kind of, I guess, the point I'm trying to make here, though, is that like for the average person, right, we need to sit with them and spend time with them. And so like to take it back to the education point of it, clients, they don't necessarily understand, but they can because they're not dumb, right? The reason why they're coming to you, an advisor, is because they're smart, they worked really hard, they saved enough money, and now they need help with it. And so I think if we approach it from that point of view of like, okay, these are smart people, they need to understand this, but I've had 10,000 hours of Bitcoin, right? They're obviously not going to understand it the way that I do. And I don't understand it the way some people who have spent 40, 50, 60,000 hours on this have. But, I don't need 60,000 hours of Bitcoin to be able to explain to a client, over several meetings why necessarily this would be appropriate for their portfolio.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this might be an unpopular statement with some people listening, but, I think that a lot of people who give advice about money for a living don't know what money is. I think the original question, your original answer is started with the conversation about what is money. And it is really this funny thing. Like I'm sure among gold bugs or libertarians, like there are people who have thought about it, but for me, having been in financial services for about the same length of time as you, people don't tend to spend their time thinking about what money actually is. It's just a really abstract and kind of obtuse question that I think before Bitcoin existed, it wasn't really even worth much time pondering, because what's the point? Like, you have to use it, and we don't have any choice. So
Yeah, for sure. And now that you have sort of this out, I think it's important to educate people on how they can take advantage of it, right? And if they don't know enough about it and they don't know enough about what money is, then they're not really going to do that, right? Because they're not going to be able to maintain a position in something that is as volatile as Bitcoin without having that level of understanding of what the technology can do.
Hmm. And the idea of having money that is finite is just a very weird idea. And I think it's like to your idea about when I talked to people about Bitcoin being a savings technology, trying to explain, I think on the one hand, everyone understands that money is becoming less valuable, and we know that we can see that by prices going up. But flipping that into the reverse to imagine that the solution could be a money that they just can't make any more of is not such a simple thing to connect those two together. It's a very strange, multi-faceted realization that comes around over time. Let's talk about the ETFs for a little bit. So we're recording this just before Christmas, and there are some big deadlines early in January where a lot of people think that Bitcoin ETFs will be coming to the US. We have them in Canada, so it's not such a big deal here, but it is a much, much, much bigger deal that they will exist in the US. So maybe just, penny for your thoughts about what the Bitcoin ETFs might mean for US markets, global markets, and the Bitcoin story in 2024.
Yeah, definitely. So if you had asked me 5 years ago, I probably would have had a different answer, which is kind of funny. But now, having worked with clients for so long and clients who actually have multi-sig setups and who hold Bitcoin the way that Bitcoin is intended to be held, I actually think it's a distraction, to be honest. But I do think that it offers a promise to people of a way in. And so, like we were talking about earlier, right, it's better to hold some Bitcoin than no Bitcoin. And it's better to hold Bitcoin incorrectly, I would say, even than to not hold any Bitcoin at all. And it's probably even better to hold Bitcoin, in an ETF than it is to hold like actual Bitcoin over an exchange, maybe not a reputable exchange where potentially your money could be seized. So at least in the ETF, right, I think that there are going to be controls in place that will make it such that the Bitcoin that you buy in the ETF will actually be there. What that means, it doesn't necessarily though mean that the Bitcoin is yours, right? You still hold an asset that holds Bitcoin. So you own the asset, but you don't own the Bitcoin. And I think that for a lot of people, they don't really care, right? The average person doesn't necessarily care whether or not they hold actual gold bars or if they hold, the gold ETF. They're like, oh, like, the gold's there, whatever. It's easier for me to hold this paper gold than it is for me to hold the actual gold. And I think for the average person, they're just going to think about it like that. It's easier for me to hold this Bitcoin paper ETF thing than it is for me to hold actual Bitcoin. I think that if people actually knew how easy it was to hold Bitcoin, then maybe they would make a different decision about that. But again, I think that we're early. And so what I think the ETF does provide for people is a leg in, a way to dip their toe in the water, to see how nice the water is before they actually go on the rest of their Bitcoin journey. For a lot of people, that's going to take a lot of time. What I noticed in my practice was that we got people involved in Bitcoin. We got them involved in the way that we could get them involved. So for some people, that meant that they actually bought Bitcoin. For other people, that meant they bought GBTC. For the people who bought GBTC, we got them involved. We got them talking about this. We got them asking questions. And then those people, then a lot of them went and actually bought Bitcoin and we sold GBTC. And now they're holding it the right way. So that's kind of my greatest hope for this ETF is that, people get involved and they start asking questions and they start learning more and they start buying books, and talking to people that know about it. And then the next thing you know, they're selling the ETF and they're actually buying Bitcoin because in the future, they want to actually use their money, not hold some sort of paper thing where they have to sell it and then go buy Bitcoin to go use their money. But what it means for the price, I mean, I'm not really sure, honestly. Like, it seems like supply and demand would say that if, billions of dollars come in and buy this ETF, then therefore they have to go and the ETF itself has to go and buy Bitcoin. And then therefore the price would go up. But it also kind of means that there aren't as many sellers as there are buyers, right? And it's pushing the price up because sellers are selling at a specific price. So there has to be the other side of the trade. And if the other side of the trade is there, then it might not actually mean anything. And if it's not there, right, then it will push the price up. So we saw, like, I think the right example for this is, and it's kind of a bad example because this is a Bitcoin podcast. So I'm sorry to bring like altcoins into this, but people would always say things like, oh, when Litecoin gets listed on Coinbase, the price is going to pump and I'm going to make out really well, or Ripple, or whatever the coin of the day is, right? People always had these conjectures of what's going to happen when it gets listed. And then it doesn't come to fruition, right? Because there are just people trading, right? And they were going to be trading anyways. And so it doesn't necessarily bring anything to the price action or so forth. So a much bigger deal is always made about these things. And then whatever happens, happens. And so I think it will bring Bitcoin adoption, but I don't know necessarily if it's going to bring the price action that people want so quickly.
One thing that I'm really excited for that I'm not sure is like appreciated as broadly among Bitcoiners is that the institutions that are hoping to profit from these products are also significant shareholder investors in most of the major media companies. So I think it's fair to expect that we're going to see a wallpaper of Bitcoin on all kinds of, the Daily Show to financial television. Like it's going to be a big story. So I think that's kind of a net positive. You mentioned gold ETFs too. The other thing I think that's interesting is the ETFs, the gold ETFs did really rocket the gold price. This is like going back 17 years or 20 years now. And this is kind of in spite of the fact that Bitcoin has solved a problem in terms of being able to verify how much Bitcoin is being owned by anyone who says they're owning it, which is a challenge with gold. So I see this as being a positive for the Bitcoin price action, because I don't think anyone in their right mind running a Bitcoin ETF would try to not actually hold the underlying asset. You'd be insane to try and paper over that one, but we'll see.
I totally agree. Yeah, I totally agree with you there. And yeah, I think there's a case to be made for both sides for sure. I guess I was playing more devil's advocate on like why necessarily the price might not go up. But yeah, the price could also go up quite a bit. And I could see it go either way, to be honest.
I'm curious, like, I think that I imagine that among people like yourself who are already working today to help clients understand the importance that Bitcoin could play in helping people plan for the future, there's going to be, there is still a lot of unknown, like we were talking about earlier in the conversation. And this kind of idea of Bitcoin financial planning is probably something that is going to look a lot different in 2035 and 2045 and 2055. And
gosh, I sure hope so.
Yeah. I mean, to your point about you think there's only going to be one currency, like where do you think Bitcoin and financial planning kind of go over the next 15 or 20 years? And none of this is investment advice. Now we're just I'm just curious to picture.
Conjecturing here. Yeah. It's a great question, honestly. So let me caveat this with, I'm probably wrong. So whatever I'm going to say, you'll play this in 20 years and everyone's going to laugh at me, and I'm okay with that. Okay. All right. Now that I've said my piece. So what I see is that advisors today are going to spend a lot of time educating and paving the way for what advisors in the future are going to be doing. And why I say that is because we're so early. There are still so many people who don't know pretty much really anything about Bitcoin, right? And so there are a lot of people who just are going to look to an advisor for guidance. There's going to be then the group of people who I'm actually dealing with who are leading the spear charge basically on all the new financial planning that's happening. So what we're running up against now with clients coming in, with lots of Bitcoin at this point, it's significant portions of their net worth, or, more than an average advisor would say is appropriate. If the average advisor says buy 1% to 3% and somebody's coming in with 20% or more, right? The average advisor is going to say, let's trim this position. What we do though, is we say, okay, is this appropriate given the client's situation, their understanding of the technology, their risk tolerance, their spouse's opinion on what's going on, how they're storing it, what kind of savings level is appropriate for this person, how much they want to have in savings versus investment, right? We were looking at it a very different way. And then from there, we're looking at all the financial planning problems really that arise in holding this asset and securing the asset. So making sure that clients are storing it properly, right? A lot of, long-term Bitcoiners are going to be storing this asset properly, but maybe they haven't let anybody else know where they've stored it. And so that's an estate planning problem that's come up multiple times of like, hey, does your wife know where you're keeping your hardware wallets? And he's like, yeah, I gave her a treasure map, but like, she has to find the treasure map because I don't want anyone to find the treasure map. I'm like, well, does she know how to find the treasure map? Yeah, I left her another treasure map, but that one's not that easy to find either. Like we're coming up with things like this now, or where like husband decides to change the location several times of the hardware wallets, for security, right? But the wife only remembers the first one. So, at some point it's like, okay, you guys are going to put yourself in a situation where you're losing your Bitcoin, right? More likely than somebody actually robbing you. So the thing that we're running into right now, just from a basic storage perspective, is like, what's the risk we're trying to mitigate here, right? Like, is it likely that somebody comes to Scott's house and, finds his Bitcoin and steals it? Or is it more likely that, it gets lost from somebody, moving this Bitcoin around multiple times, trying to protect it, or, hardware wallet malfunctioning, or seed cards aren't being stored properly, right? And the hardware malfunctions, or it's in a fire or so forth, right? Like, so we're trying to mitigate these other risks. These are problems, though, that I don't think are going to exist in 20 to 30 years because they're going to be worked out, right? It's not going to be what you go to an advisor for. People are coming to me now because it's new, right? They don't know how to do it. And so what I think is happening now is we're paving the way for like, what are going to be best procedures for people to be doing given their situations, and that we're going to basically have standard operating procedures for if you're in this situation, this is what you do. If you're, if you're married with kids, how you handle that. If you're married with young kids, how you handle that. If you're, unmarried, like how are you dealing with storage and estate planning? If you're, in the older generation, how are you dealing with gifting, or how are you dealing with storage so that the next generation who you're passing it to doesn't necessarily have access to it now, but will have access to it at the right time, right? There's all these little things that are going into passing wealth in a way that's not in the system that we haven't really approached before. And then there's just like general estate planning. So it's applying the principles of estate planning that exist today to money, this new money, and how it's going to pass. And so that's on a state by state basis that we work closely with estate attorneys on to make sure that we're planning for it appropriately, that we're assigning the Bitcoin to trusts appropriately and so forth. So I think that all of this stuff is stuff that we're sort of out there trying to figure out right now, but will be hammered out and will be kind of tried and true in 20 to 30 years from now. And so there'll be new problems, obviously, that will come up for people that financial planners will fix.
You're involved with a network of Bitcoin financial advisors, and you tweeted recently that the CFP board has reached out to start some dialogue. What's going on there?
So we don't really know, to be honest. And this is recorded before Christmas, like you said, in 2023. So we don't really know. We have until January 5th to respond to them. We're split as a network on what we think. Some of us think that they just want information about what Bitcoin financial advisors are doing and how they're doing it, because that information is not necessarily super public. Some of us do think that they're trying to take enforcement action against us just based on who it came from and how it's worded. I'm not really sure. I emailed them and asked for more information before I answer anything. So I wish I can give you more insight as to what's happening. I'm sure will unfold and potentially publicly unfold what's going on. The way I see it right now is that they could have, if they want information about what we're doing, they could have reached out in a way that was more productive. And that this is not the right way to get information from people who aren't doing anything wrong. Like I've been through a state examination while dealing with clients with Bitcoin. Texas didn't find anything wrong with what we're doing. Other people in the network have also been through their state examinations and SEC examinations, and nothing was said to be wrong with what we were doing in Bitcoin. So for the CFP board to turn around and say that we're doing something wrong and it violates their ethics, it's unclear whether or not that would actually be true. I mean, we're a group of people who care about our clients quite a bit. We do right by our clients. We charge appropriate fees that are agreed upon. We don't egregiously charge people for what we're doing. We don't charge them in any hidden kind of ways. We don't sell Bitcoin to people and then take a cut or commission or anything like that. We're all just fee-only CFP financial planners who are trying to help clients who have questions about their Bitcoin. So from my perspective, like, we're not doing anything wrong. We have nothing to hide. And I'm willing to take a stand for the community about it. And I guess it's yet to be seen whether or not they're going to think that we're behaving appropriately in the community or not. And so I do think, though, that my CFP might be at risk. And I'm willing to fight for both the community and my CFP. So we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, it feels a little bit like the horse producers of America coming for the early auto manufacturers. Or I mean, I make a joke about it, but it's tragic, because I do think that Bitcoin, it's not just a niche thing that could be, a good performing asset in your portfolio. Like, I personally believe it's the single most important thing people need to be thinking about for having any kind of long-term plan for wealth protection. And so it's tragic that we're in this kind of like, it's maybe the moment where money failing has arrived before the general understanding of the solution has germinated properly among professionals. And I'm thinking about something you said earlier, this idea about two things being true. So I really believe, I'm going to play this game, two things that are true. One thing that's true is financial advisors are really important, and they do make huge difference. People who work with financial advisors versus those who don't tend to end up in radically different places later in life. But it's also true that 99% of financial advisors do not understand Bitcoin even enough to understand why, they just don't even know what it does or why you would want to own it, let alone be able to have an educated conversation with the client about it. And that's a big problem. So I'm really interested about this thing that's going on with you, and I hope that I'll be following it curiously to see where you guys go.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I would say too is that this doesn't change what we're doing. So the CFP boards, doing whatever they're saying they're doing, they're not the government. At the end of the day, we are registered investment advisors with either our state or the SEC. And if the states and the SEC say that what we're doing is fine, then we continue to operate. If it's the states and the SEC that turn around and say that we can't do this anymore, I would be hard pressed to find how they would do that, given that the SEC has come out multiple times and said that Bitcoin is a commodity, and that it's other, digital assets and cryptocurrencies that they're looking at as being registered securities. So we're not selling any unregistered securities, if you're going to put a sales term on it. We're just advising people, for the most part, who already own Bitcoin, what they should be doing. And for people who don't own Bitcoin, we're just telling them why they might want to buy some. We don't force anybody to buy. We just give them information, and then they decide whether or not they're going to do it. Right. And so that's what financial planners do in general. Right. They say, okay, like, these are your options. Do you want to do this or this? Right. And we just lay it out for the client in a way that makes sense given their financial situation, because that's why they're going to a client. And as long as we are providing the services that we say we're providing, and we do it in a way that is with full disclosure, and we charge the fees that are appropriate, that a client has agreed to, that are, again, fully disclosed, and we are not violating any state or federal agreements, basically. And so the CFP can't create their own their own dialogue and their own whole scope of what people can and can't do above that. They can remove CFPs from people for sure. And I would say that that's fine, and we'll just continue to operate the way that we're operating, just not with the CFP board anymore. It would be unfortunate because the CFP, prior to FTX going down, had made it clear that they wanted to be a little bit more descriptive and inclusive on how they contribute to, as they said, digital assets and what they put in their curriculum and so forth. And they basically nixed that after FTX collapsed. But I don't think that they're going in the right direction, right? The right direction is, okay, they're bad actors. They're bad actors in every aspect of finance, right? That's the reason why the CFP exists. We exist because we're good actors. We are showing what people should do. We are the guiding light of how people can be ethical and work in finance and help people, right? And so that aligns 100% with what's going on in Bitcoin. Bitcoin is here to help people, to save people from what's going on in the financial system, to find a way out of just being buried under debt and dilution and so forth, and materialism, really. And the CFP can be part of something very, very good if they want to be.
For people who are listening and maybe they're not quite ready to take the plunge on owning some Bitcoin, or thinking about asking their financial advisor about where to start, is there somewhere like a resource that you recommend to people who are just putting a pinky toe in the water, or a question or two that you help maybe people take away as they are just figuring out where to go?
Yeah, so I actually really like Andy Edstrom's book for people starting out. It's Why Buy Bitcoin. It's a book I gave to my dad actually, and he liked it quite a bit. I think that because Andy, so Andy's also a financial advisor, and as he's worked in mainstream large companies the way I have, and so his perspective on things and how he explains it is really helpful to somebody who's just kind of average rather than, there are a lot of Bitcoin books out there that are amazing, but, they're very technical or they're, very much libertarian, and it's not to say that, Andy's not those things too, but the way he wrote this book is really for, just the average person who is working really hard and who has made some money and who kind of understands the ins and outs of, basic finance to understand why you would want to own Bitcoin. So I think that's a really good resource for people. And Andy's he's a great guy, and you should follow him on Twitter anyways, because he's got good content.
Cool. I think it's so cool what you guys are doing. It's this. I think this time we're living in today is kind of an unprecedented time for the pressure for people to conform intellectually and think the way that they're told to think. And so for your network, you guys are doing something really important by sort of trailblazing in spite of immense pressure to not do what you're doing. And so I'm thankful that there are people out there, professionals like yourself, that are doing this work today, and excited to see where it leads to, like you were saying, in 5, 10, and 15 years. For people who want to find more of you online and are listening, is there somewhere they can go to do that?
Yeah, sure. So you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Morgen with an E Rochard. I have my financial planning practice is Origin Wealth Advisors. It's originwa.com. I also do Bitcoin consulting. So if you just need a little advice on, how you're storing it and, just little Bitcoin related questions, then you can find me at moneyowners.com. If you're actually looking for, how much Bitcoin should I hold? Unfortunately, I can't advise anyone in that capacity there. You have to be in my registered investment advisor, whereas the legal place for me to give investment advice. I've had that question come up quite a bit. So unfortunately, my hands are tied. And the reason why fees are very different, let's say in Money Owners, and much lower and more affordable, is because they don't have the regulatory overhead that I have in my financial planning practice. So I'm sorry for that. And then I did write a book. It's called The QuickStart Guide to Personal Finance. You can find that on Amazon. I'm currently working on another book, which will be the Bitcoin Personal Finance book. I hope to have that out next year. I really do. I'm working on it, and it'll be out as soon as I can.
Right on. Morgen, thanks so much for coming on the show. When you do get that second book, I would love to have you back, and we can talk about that one.
That sounds great. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Block Reward. We're trying to do something different here, creating accessible conversations meant for people who aren't obsessed with Bitcoin. If you found this episode informative and engaging, hit that subscribe button to make sure you stay updated with future episodes. Your feedback matters. We'd greatly appreciate it if you could take a moment to share your reviews and help us with our goal of creating Bitcoin content that is simple and easy to understand. Bitcoin has an important role to play in the future of finance. It will change the way we save, spend, and invest. Discover why Bitcoin offers a game-changing opportunity for forward-thinking employers by visiting blockrewards.ca. Block Rewards' mission is helping Canadian employers implement strategies for integrating Bitcoin into compensation and benefits, supercharge your recruitment and retention strategies, and help your team members plan for the rising cost of living by rewarding their work with the hardest money ever invented. Special thanks to our top sponsor, Paramount Employee Benefits Consulting, Canada's only Bitcoin-forward benefits and pension advisory. For more information, find them at paramountbenefits.ca. Big shout out to Podigy, our production team that makes all this possible, and BMX Escape for producing our music. Bitcoin is an expansive and dense topic many people walk away from early. To Bitcoin enthusiasts looking for that podcast they can share with friends, family, and colleagues, one they'll actually listen to, we hope that is us. The content of these conversations is meant to be provided for information purposes only. Nothing here is investment advice. Bitcoin is a big topic. Be sure to do your own research before making any personal financial decisions. Thanks for listening.